The soft hum of conversation echoed through the sleek terminal as Danielle Mercer made her way toward the first-class gate, her heels clicking rhythmically across the polished floor. Dressed in a deep charcoal blazer, a silk blouse, and tailored slacks, she exuded quiet authority. Her natural curls framed her face in a halo of determination, and her steady gaze barely flickered as eyes turned to follow her. She was used to the glances, the second looks, the barely concealed double takes. She had spent her career navigating boardrooms full of men who underestimated her, and now she was used to the surprise when people realized she belonged exactly where she stood. But no matter how many times it happened, the subtle undertones of suspicion still stung. She approached the gate with the effortless confidence of someone who had earned her place in the world over decades of work, achievement, and poise. Her boarding pass scanned with a soft beep, and the young man at the counter hesitated. Just for a second, just long enough, his eyes flicked from the screen to her face, then back again. He masked it quickly behind a smile, but Danielle saw it. She always saw it. "Enjoy your flight, Ms. Mercer," he said with practiced cheer. She gave a polite nod and walked on. The jet bridge was cool and sterile, the kind of in-between space where masks stayed firmly in place, where people smiled without seeing each other. Danielle stepped aboard the aircraft, her carry-on light, her mind already shifting to the strategic presentation she'd be giving the next morning. As she turned into the first-class cabin, a blonde flight attendant standing near the galley offered a mechanical "welcome aboard," but didn't meet her eyes. Danielle responded with a soft "thank you," though the words felt hollow between them. She reached her seat, 2A, a window, and stowed her bag neatly above. The other passengers were already settling in. A white man in a navy suit 2 rows ahead chatted with a flight attendant, laughing at something she'd said. Across the aisle, an older couple sipped champagne and murmured to one another. It was a peaceful scene, comfortable, elegant. But Danielle felt the subtle vibration of something else, a shift in energy, an undercurrent of exclusion that followed her like a shadow. She sat down, crossed one leg over the other, and took a slow breath. She wasn't going to let a few offhand glances rattle her. She had meetings to prepare for and a legacy to build. Still, when the flight attendants began their round of pre-departure service, it became impossible to ignore. The blonde attendant, name tag reading K. Ellis, moved down the aisle, placing menus into the hands of each first-class passenger with a glossy smile and a light word. Danielle waited, assuming she would be next, but Ellis skipped her without hesitation, walking right past as if the seat were empty. Danielle blinked. At first, she thought perhaps it was an oversight. Perhaps the flight attendant simply hadn't seen her. But when Ellis returned moments later with champagne for the couple across the aisle, again passing Danielle without a glance, the intent became unmistakable. Her smile remained for others, but for Danielle, there was only silence. She pressed the call button. The chime echoed, and within seconds, Ellis appeared. "Yes?" she asked, eyes narrowed with subtle irritation. Danielle's voice was calm, steady. "I noticed I didn't receive a menu." Ellis paused, a split second of surprise flitting across her face. "We may have run out," she said flatly. "I'll check." Without waiting for a response, she turned and disappeared. Danielle exhaled slowly, her fingers curled slightly against the armrest. It wasn't about a menu. It never was. It was about the way her presence had been dismissed without acknowledgement, the way others were greeted with warmth while she was met with indifference. The quiet dismissal hurt more than outright disrespect. It was designed to make her question herself, to make her wonder if she was imagining it. But she wasn't. Minutes passed, no menu arrived, no apology, no acknowledgement. Another flight attendant, tall, dark-haired, and younger, passed by with the meal cart, offering options to the other passengers. Danielle raised her hand gently. "Excuse me," she said. "I wasn't given a menu, so I'm not sure what the meal options are." Then the young woman looked startled. "Oh, I'm sorry, ma'am. I'll check on that." Danielle gave a tight nod. She wasn't going to make a scene. Not yet. But the weight in her chest grew heavier with each moment of silence. It wasn't just about service, it was about visibility. In that cabin, she was invisible. And invisibility, she knew, was one of the most violent forms of erasure. The man across the aisle, the one in the navy suit, met her gaze briefly. There was a flicker of understanding there. Guilt, maybe, but he said nothing. No one ever did. Danielle folded her hands in her lap and looked out the window. The runway stretched long and gray beneath the fading light. She'd been here before, in airports, hotels, offices, where she was expected to shrink herself. But she wouldn't. Not now. Not ever. She was going to make sure that what was happening to her, this deliberate, calculated neglect, was not forgotten once the plane landed. Because this wasn't just a flight. It was a pattern. And this time she wasn't going to stay quiet. The moment Maya Daniels stepped into the first-class cabin, the air shifted. Not because she commanded attention in an obvious way, but because she carried herself with quiet purpose. The kind of self-assuredness that came from years of fighting battles no one saw and earning every ounce of respect that still, too often, wasn't freely given. Her tailored suit, the subtle glint of silver jewelry, the worn leather briefcase tucked against her side, it all spoke to who she was, accomplished, composed, and unapologetically present. She didn't need validation from anyone. But as the plane began to fill and the glances grew colder, she felt the familiar tension settle around her like fog. She took her seat, 1C, a coveted aisle in first class reserved weeks in advance. She had a major keynote presentation to deliver the next morning, representing a company she helped build from the ground up. For Maya, every detail mattered. Every moment of rest counted. But today, peace would prove elusive. It started small. The way the lead flight attendant, Carla, greeted the older man beside her with a beaming smile and champagne, while offering Maya a barely audible hi and no eye contact. The way pre-departure drinks were offered to every other first-class passenger, while Maya's request for water was met with a moise Sam and a brusque Worshana. Somayim, we're not serving beverages yet. She had heard that tone before. Curt, cold, just on the edge of contempt. She didn't flinch. She didn't roll her eyes or demand anything. Instead, she opened her phone and quietly began to take notes. The old version of herself might have called it out right then. Might have made a scene, raised her voice, insisted on respect. But Maya had learned there was power in calm, in composure, in documenting every slight with chilling precision, so when the time came, no one could deny what had happened. She sat still and watched. Carla moved easily from row to row, her smile warm for every passenger, except Maya. With each pass, Maya noticed the deliberate avoidance, the subtle exclusion. Other passengers were offered dinner menus with an explanation of the chef's inspiration. She received none. When she politely asked for one, Carla sighed and said she might have a spare. None came. Still, Maya said nothing. Instead, she clicked open a note on her phone and began recording timestamps, quotes, even the body language. The narrowed eyes, the dismissive tone, the tray placed in front of her with just enough force to make a statement. This wasn't incompetence, it was intentional. And it was unfolding at 30,000 feet. As the dinner service began, the man beside her, a middle-aged consultant in a checkered tie, glanced at her tray and then his. His salad had fresh arugula, a warm roll, and a side of roasted walnuts. Hers was missing the dressing and the bread entirely. He opened his mouth, hesitated, then said nothing. Maya gave a tight smile, eyes never leaving Carla, as she continued her flawless act of attentive service to every row except hers. But inside, Maya's pulse thrummed with emotion, not just anger but exhaustion. The kind of exhaustion that comes from having to weigh every reaction, every word, every decision about whether to respond or let it go. Whether speaking up would mark her as difficult or aggressive. Whether her silence would give permission for the mistreatment to continue. And still, she stayed calm. Because Maya Daniels wasn't just any passenger. She was the chief ethics officer of one of the top consulting firms in the country, the very woman airlines had paid to come audit their leadership and fix toxic culture. And though Carla had no idea who she was, Maya had seen enough to know that this wasn't just about her. It was about something deeper, systemic, persistent, and it needed to be confronted, but not emotionally, strategically. After dinner, she pressed the call button. Carla arrived with a pasted-on smile. Yes? Maya's voice was like water over stone, smooth, unshaken. I'd like to understand why I was skipped during initial service, and why I didn't receive a menu like the other passengers. Carla's mask cracked. We must have run out. I was told. I saw you deliver menus to every seat in this cabin except mine, Maya said quietly. I've documented the entire experience. Carla straightened. Ma'am, if you're not satisfied, you can contact customer service after landing. Maya nodded. I will, and I'll also be speaking directly to your regional director. Do you know his name? Carla blinked. No, ma'am. I do, Maya said, her gaze like steel. And he knows mine. The color drained from Carla's face. She gave a stiff nod and walked away without another word. Maya sat back, heart pounding, but face still composed. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't made a scene, but her words had landed like a blade. Passengers nearby had turned their heads, silently wondering what had happened. The man beside her finally spoke. I saw it all, he said, almost whispering. That was wrong. I'm sorry. Maya didn't look at him. She didn't need his validation, but she appreciated the acknowledgement. Thank you, she said softly. As the plane began its descent, Maya reached into her bag and pulled out a sealed envelope. Inside it was a folded memo, a draft version of a new policy proposal on equity training for frontline staff in hospitality industries. It was a document she had prepared weeks ago for an upcoming client, a client that happened to be this airline. But tonight she would revise it. And tomorrow, when she stepped into that meeting, she would speak not as a consultant hired to fix problems on paper, but as a passenger who had lived the consequences firsthand. They didn't know who she was, but they would. So to everyone listening, whether you've ever been dismissed, disrespected, or made to feel invisible, let Maya's story remind you, you don't have to shout to be heard. You don't have to match someone's ignorance with rage. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is remain calm, stay professional, and make sure the right people hear your truth. If Maya's strength moved you, drop a comment below. Let her know you stand with her. Hit that like button to support stories like hers, because this isn't just about one flight. It's about all of us. And we are watching, we are remembering, and we will not be silent. Selena Vaughn didn't raise her voice. She never needed to. A calm gaze, a measured word, a quiet pause. That was her way. But on that flight, seated in 2A of the first-class cabin, something inside her began to crack. Not from fury, but from the exhaustion of enduring disrespect dressed up as protocol. She had boarded the plane that morning with every expectation of peace. Her week had already been long, 3 conferences in 5 days, sleepless nights working on behalf of underrepresented voices in corporate leadership, and a visit to her elderly mother who barely remembered her name these days. All Selena wanted was a moment of stillness above the clouds. Instead, she was met with resistance before she even took her seat. The moment she boarded, she noticed the way the flight attendant, Monica, looked past her, her tone neutral but cold. When Selena asked if she could store her laptop bag overhead, Monica didn't offer help, just pointed vaguely and walked off. Selena had sighed, accustomed to such subtle slights, but her bones ached with the weight of it. She had no desire to pick a fight, but that was before things escalated. After the passengers settled and the drink service began, Monica made her way through the first-class cabin. Smiling, laughing even, she greeted each row with care, offering champagne, orange juice, and menus. When she reached the row just ahead of Selena, she knelt down slightly, explained the entrees in detail, and took her time listening. But when she got to Selena, her entire demeanor changed. She stood up straighter, didn't make eye contact, and muttered, "We're out of menus, so you'll just get whatever's left." Selena blinked. "I'm sorry, I didn't get a menu when I boarded." "We've run out," Monica replied curtly, then moved on. Selena didn't argue. She just stared at the empty space where the menu should have been and slowly exhaled. She had the direct number of the airline's CEO in her phone, Cameron Ellis, because she was a senior consultant who had worked closely with him during a multi-million-dollar company-wide restructuring. But she didn't want to call him, not yet. This needed to unfold. This needed to be seen, unprovoked. Still, the disrespect gnawed at her, not because it was the first time, but because it always came with the same expectation, that she would swallow it and smile. Selena pulled out her phone, jotting down a quick note: date, time, flight number, Monica's name. She wasn't reacting emotionally. She was building a case. She returned her gaze to the window, the clouds indifferent in their beauty, while her mind ran a quiet tally. But then came the moment that broke her. A little girl, no older than 6, wandered down the aisle from economy with her stuffed lion in hand, tears in her eyes. "I can't find my mommy," she whispered, and passengers turned, startled. Selena immediately unbuckled her seatbelt and rose, kneeling gently in front of the girl. "What's your name, sweetheart?" "Amara," she sniffled, clutching her toy tighter. Selena wrapped an arm gently around her shoulder. "We'll find your mom, Amara, I promise." She looked around, expecting Monica or another attendant to rush over. But Monica stood frozen by the galley, watching from a distance, unmoved. "Excuse me," Selena called out, still kneeling. "We have a lost child here." Monica slowly approached, annoyance flickering behind her smile. "She must have wandered up from the back. We'll handle it," she said, reaching for the girl's arm. Amara shrank back. "She's frightened," Selena said, her voice still even. "Let's be gentle." Another passenger, an elderly woman with gray curls, stood up and nodded toward Monica. "She's been with this woman for 2 minutes and already looks calmer. Maybe let her walk the girl back?" Monica's expression tightened, but she nodded and stepped back. Selena took Amara's hand, softly guiding her through the curtain dividing first class from economy. She scanned the rows until she heard a frantic voice call out, "Amara! Oh my God, baby!" A woman stood up, face streaked with tears. Amara broke into a run, and they collided in a sobbing embrace. The mother looked up at Selena with tearful gratitude. "Thank you. Thank you so much." Selena smiled gently. She's safe now. By the time she returned to her seat, the cabin had grown quieter. Several passengers had witnessed the exchange. One man gave her a subtle nod of respect. The older woman from earlier mouthed, "Thank you." Selena sat down and didn't look for validation. But now she knew. She couldn't stay silent. She reached for her phone again, this time scrolling to her contact list and pressing on the name C. Ellis. The phone rang once. "Selena?" Cameron answered. "Everything all right?" Selena's voice was cool, calm, unwavering. "Not quite. I need to tell you about something that happened on your plane today, and I suggest you listen carefully." And in the space of a few minutes, she told him everything. Not just about the menu, not just about Monica's tone, but about a culture of selective kindness, a pattern of disrespect too easily dismissed, a child in distress who was ignored until someone with compassion stepped in. When she finished, Cameron's voice was firm. "You know I trust you. I'll handle this." Selena nodded, her voice low. "I know you will, and I'll be watching." To everyone listening, this is why composure matters, why strategy matters. Because sometimes the loudest power is the one that speaks softly but doesn't waver. If you believe Selena did the right thing, leave a comment below. Let her know her voice matters, because she stood tall for herself and for a frightened little girl. And that is strength worth honoring. Danielle Moore sat in seat 3A, hands folded neatly on her lap, her posture impeccable, her composure unshaken. But her spirit that day felt threadbare. She had boarded the plane not expecting a fight, but something about the moment her heels crossed the threshold into first class had warned her. This flight would not be simple. Danielle was no stranger to discomfort cloaked in civility. At 38, she was a senior executive with accolades stretching farther than many would imagine. But the moment she stepped into spaces like this, elegant, exclusive, whisper quiet, there was always someone who looked at her and wondered, does she belong here? That morning, she had arrived at the airport straight from a board meeting, her charcoal suit still crisp, her travel bag neatly packed. Her hair framed her face in a soft blowout, and her eyes, steady and sharp, missed nothing. She was tired, sure, but not broken. Not yet. She approached the gate and handed over her ticket. The agent barely concealed her surprise as she scanned the first-class boarding pass. "You're in 3A," she said with a forced smile. "Enjoy your flight." Danielle nodded politely, but she'd already cataloged the pause, the half-second hesitation. She always did. The cabin was quiet when she boarded. Morning light filtered through the oval windows, casting soft shadows over the cream leather seats. She moved past rows of passengers already seated, most of them older, white, dressed in relaxed wealth. Some offered distracted glances, others didn't look at her at all. The flight attendant standing at the front, a tall woman with clipped blonde hair and a name tag that read Karen E., looked Danielle up and down with a flicker of skepticism that might have gone unnoticed by someone who hadn't seen it before. But Danielle had. too many times. "Good morning," Danielle said warmly as she passed. Karen didn't respond, not with words, just a nod so small it could have been mistaken for a glitch in movement. Danielle took her seat in silence. She exhaled slowly. Not today, she thought. Just get through the flight. When pre-departure service began, Danielle watched as Karen offered drinks to each first-class passenger. Mimosas, champagne, hot towels. She approached a white man across the aisle with a wide smile, laughed at his joke, handed him a menu with both hands. Danielle waited. Karen skipped her row. She moved past Danielle without a glance. No eye contact, no smile, no menu. Danielle stared at the empty tray before her. Her stomach clenched. She gave it a moment, hoping it was a mistake. But 15 minutes passed. Passengers settled in. Orders were taken. Champagne corks popped. Danielle pressed the call button. Karen returned with a taut expression, the kind that feigned surprise but reeked of pretense. "Yes," she said. "I wasn't given a menu," Danielle said, her voice calm but clear. Karen blinked. "Oh, we're short on menus," she replied quickly. "I'll try to find you one." Then she turned and walked away. No apology, no urgency. Danielle stared at the back of the woman's uniform as she disappeared into the galley. Her chest rose slowly with a breath she didn't want to take. The flame of humiliation sparked behind her ribs. She didn't want to react. That's what they always waited for. Emotion, outbursts, proof that she was difficult. She folded her hands again. She would not give them that. But as she sat, silently stewing in the echo of absence, something shifted. From across the aisle, the white man in 3B, the same one who had been offered a drink and a smile, leaned toward her. "Excuse me," he said, and he said finally. Danielle turned, unsure if he was speaking to her. "I hope you don't mind," he continued, "but I saw what happened." Danielle tilted her head slightly, surprised. He cleared his throat. "You were skipped. On purpose. That wasn't okay." Her heart startled in her chest. It was a simple sentence, soft, unassuming, but it rang like a bell in the silence around her. Danielle's voice was quiet. "Thank you for saying something." The man nodded. "It's not much, but you're not imagining it. I just wanted you to know that." It wasn't loud. It wasn't public. He wasn't trying to be a savior. But in that moment, in that space where so many stayed silent, he saw her, and that changed everything. Danielle turned back to her seat. The tightness in her throat loosened, just slightly. She was still angry, still hurt, but not alone. 5 minutes later, another attendant, a younger woman, approached and handed Danielle a menu. Her eyes flitted away quickly, her expression tight. Danielle didn't thank her, not yet, not until they earned it. And as the flight wore on, Danielle quietly documented every moment. The times she was ignored, the looks cast her way, the conversations around her, and that quiet voice across the aisle, that stranger who affirmed her reality. It reminded her why she would speak up when the time came. Because silence had never protected her. But being seen made the burden just a little lighter. If you believe in this power of speaking up, of seeing someone when others pretend not to, drop a comment below. Danielle's grace under pressure is something we can all learn from. And sometimes all it takes is one voice to remind someone, you're not invisible. Helen Carter didn't expect an apology. Not after the way she'd been treated since stepping onto the flight, silently excluded from the service rituals meant to define first class, ignored while her neighbors were greeted with beaming smiles and champagne, and spoken to only with the kind of forced courtesy reserved for people others didn't want to see. It wasn't a surprise, but it never stopped stinging. She had traveled this route many times, both literally and metaphorically. A successful ethics consultant and executive strategist, Helen had spent the last 15 years helping Fortune 500 companies confront the cultural rot they often tried to ignore. She knew how systems worked. She knew how bias crept in through the smallest cracks, like the way a flight attendant smiled at every passenger but her, or how no one seemed to notice she hadn't been offered a menu, a drink, or even acknowledgement. But it was never just about the drink or the menu. It was the message underneath. You don't belong here. Helen had stayed composed. She always did. Her restraint wasn't passivity. It was power, focused and precise. She documented the infractions quietly on her phone. She remembered names. She made mental notes. She had called the CEO from her seat without theatrics, her voice calm, every word sharp. She didn't need to scream to be heard. She just needed to tell the truth. So when the younger flight attendant, the one with the quiet eyes and nervous hands, approached her, Helen was surprised. The girl stood just beside Helen's seat, fingers knotted tightly together, shoulders stiff. The cabin had dimmed for the evening meal service, and the hum of conversation buzzed low around them. "Miss Carter?" the girl said softly. Helen looked up, her expression unreadable. "I'm Megan. I just wanted to say I'm sorry," she said, voice trembling. "For what happened earlier? For how you were treated?" Helen blinked, studying her. This wasn't performative. There was no script behind the girl's eyes, just discomfort, regret, and something that looked like sincerity. I should have stepped in," Megan continued. "I saw it, all of it, and I said nothing. I thought maybe I could make up for it by checking on you later, but that doesn't feel like enough. It isn't." Helen tilted her head, her voice calm but firm. "You're right, it's not." Megan swallowed hard, her cheeks flushing, but she didn't turn away, and something in Helen softened. Not out of pity, but from the weight of the moment. This was different. "Have a seat," Helen said, gesturing to the empty aisle seat beside her. Megan hesitated, then sat down quickly, eyes wide, hands still clasped. "I'm not here to scold you," Helen said, her voice low, "but I do want you to understand something." Megan nodded quickly. "Okay." "You saw it happen," Helen began. "You saw how I was skipped, how your coworker looked through me like I wasn't even there, and you felt uncomfortable." "Yes," Megan whispered. "That discomfort, that's the beginning. That's your conscience telling you something's wrong. But allyship," Helen continued, "is what happens after that discomfort. It's what you do with it." Megan blinked, her eyes glassy. "I didn't know what to say. I was afraid." Helen nodded slowly. "Fear is real, but so is silence. And when you say nothing, when you look away, when you stay neutral, you're not protecting anyone. You're reinforcing the system that allows it to happen." A tear slipped down Megan's cheek before she could wipe it away. "I didn't want to cause trouble," she said. "But watching you, how calm you were, how you stood up for yourself, I realized silence causes more harm." Helen looked at her gently. "That realization is the first step. What matters now is the next one." Megan nodded, wiping her face. "I want to do better." "I will." "Then speak up next time," Helen said. "Not just for people who look like me, but for anyone who's being treated unfairly." The cabin lights dimmed further, casting soft amber shadows across their faces. Helen could feel other passengers glancing toward them, aware something intimate was unfolding. She didn't care. This wasn't for them. This was about planting something in Megan that might grow into courage. "I'm not asking for perfection," Helen added, "but you work in a space where people feel vulnerable, traveling, trusting, expecting dignity. You can be someone who restores that. You can be someone who makes people feel seen." Megan sat with those words for a long moment. "Thank you," she finally said, her voice no longer shaking, "for giving me the chance to listen and learn." Helen nodded. "Make sure it wasn't wasted." The young woman stood quietly, offered a final glance of gratitude, and returned to the galley. Helen turned back toward the window, watching as clouds streaked across the sky like rivers of light. She had no illusion that one conversation would change the world, but maybe it had changed one person. And sometimes that's how change begins. So if this moment moved you, listener, if you've ever felt invisible in a space you earned the right to occupy, let this be your reminder. You are not alone. And if you've ever stood on the sidelines unsure of whether to speak, let Megan's lesson guide you. Because real change doesn't start with outrage. It starts with integrity, with truth, with someone choosing to do the right thing, even when their voice shakes. If Helen's strength inspired you, leave a comment to encourage her. And if Megan's courage gives you hope for the next generation, hit that like button. Subscribe to the channel for more true stories that reveal the quiet power of accountability, resilience, and doing what's right when no one expects it. The moment Helen ended the call, she stared at the phone in her hand, her chest rising and falling in a slow, measured rhythm. On the surface, she looked unshaken, composed, elegant, in control. But inside, a quiet storm raged. She had done her part. She had reported the behavior. And now it was up to Jonathan Marks, the CEO of the airline, and a man she once believed in. Helen had known Jonathan for years. They'd met in a boardroom, debating ethics reform and corporate responsibility. He was sharp, driven, and unusually candid for a man in his position. They had disagreed often, but she had respected him because when he promised change, he usually followed through. This time, however, it was personal. She hadn't called him in anger. She hadn't called to demand a show or a spectacle. She had called because he needed to know that his company, the one he boasted about for its inclusive values, had just tried to erase her. Not with violence, but with silence, with cold stares, dismissive service, and the quiet belief that someone like her didn't belong in seat 1A. Helen gazed out the window. The clouds passed like ghostly waves beneath the plane, the sun beginning to dip into gold. Somewhere above all this, a decision was being made, and she needed it to matter. Less than 20 minutes later, her phone buzzed. "Jonathan Marks," she answered. "Jonathan?" "Helen," his voice came through tight with tension. "I've just finished speaking with the head of operations. I'm furious, absolutely furious." She stayed silent, letting him feel the weight of it. "I don't care how small they thought their actions were," he continued. "It was intentional. I read your notes. I spoke with my staff, and I'm taking immediate action." Helen's eyes narrowed slightly. "Define immediate." "They'll be removed from duty the moment this flight lands," he said. "And a formal investigation will begin tonight. But that's not where it ends. I'm flying in to meet you myself." She blinked. "You're what?" "I'm catching a red-eye. I'll be in your city by morning." "You're right, Helen. This isn't just about a rude crew. This is a cultural rot, and I'm not going to let it grow." For a moment, Helen didn't respond, not because she didn't believe him, but because it stirred something deeper than anger. Relief, the kind that comes not when justice is complete, but when someone finally says, "I see it too." "Thank you," she said quietly. "No, thank you," he replied, "for holding us accountable. I'll see you in the morning." When she ended the call, Helen didn't exhale right away. Her fingers pressed lightly to her temples as emotion crept in, slowly, like warm rain on dry earth. It wasn't over, but something had shifted. The moment had been acknowledged. The truth had been named. And in a world where so many people were silenced, that alone was a small revolution. But it still hurt. Because beneath the corporate action plans and HR memos, there was still the ache of what had happened, the sting of being looked through like glass, the humiliation of needing to ask for basic dignity. Helen had spent her entire life becoming a woman who changed systems. And yet here she was, still being challenged for merely existing in a space she'd earned. Later in the flight, after the seatbelt sign had blinked off and the cabin settled into a hushed rhythm, a new attendant approached her. Not the blonde who had skipped her, not the ones who had ignored her call light. This one looked younger and nervous. Her name tag read Samantha. "Miss Carter," she said gently, "the captain asked me to personally check if there's anything you need." Helen looked up. "I'm fine," she said. Her voice was steady, her smile tight. "But thank you." Samantha hesitated. I heard what happened. I'm sorry." Helen gave her a long, unreadable look. "Then make sure it doesn't happen again. Not to anyone." Samantha nodded, her eyes full of understanding, and quietly stepped away. By the time the plane touched down, Helen was ready. She exited the aircraft slowly, her posture tall, her steps purposeful. She could feel the eyes of the crew on her. She didn't look back. Outside the gate, a black car was already waiting. Inside, her assistant Maria sat holding a tablet, her expression unreadable. "He's already on the ground," Maria said as Helen slid into the back seat. Helen raised an eyebrow. "He wasn't joking." "Nope," Maria replied. "And he wants to meet at 10 a.m. Says this one's going to be different." Helen looked out the window as the city lights flickered in the distance. It better be. The next morning, she stood across from Jonathan Marks in a high-rise conference room with panoramic views. His tie was loose, his hair tousled. He looked like a man who hadn't slept. Good. She hadn't either. "I've already fired the crew involved," he told her bluntly. "In the training department, under review." We're bringing in external accountability. You have my full support, and I want you to lead the reform initiative." Helen tilted her head. "You want me to fix your house from the inside?" "I want you to help rebuild it," he replied, this time from the ground up. And in that moment, Helen realized something important. The pain she had endured wasn't in vain. It had cracked something open. It had exposed a system. And now she had the power not just to demand justice, but to shape it. If you've made it this far, listener, thank you. This isn't just Helen's story. It's a reminder that injustice often wears a polite smile. That silence can be a weapon. And that sometimes all it takes is one person willing to speak the truth, to shake an entire system awake. If you believe in holding power accountable, if you admire Helen's strength, leave a comment below to support her. Hit the like button, share the story, and subscribe for more true tales of resilience, reform, and quiet power that changes everything. Helen sat alone in the executive boardroom, sunlight pouring in through the wall of windows behind her, casting long streaks of gold across the polished table. She had requested this meeting, no, demanded it, not as a courtesy call, not as a moment to soothe bruised egos or accept hollow apologies. She was here for something far more difficult, far more urgent. She wasn't just fighting for herself, she was fighting for every passenger who had ever been mistreated, overlooked, or silenced. For every woman who had been talked down to. For every Black traveler whose presence in first class sparked quiet suspicion. For every person who had swallowed injustice just to make it to their destination in peace. Across from her sat a half circle of senior executives from the airline. Suits, smartwatches, notepads. A few looked uncomfortable, a few looked curious. One or two were already rehearsing their defenses in their heads. Helen could see it in their tight postures, their fidgeting fingers, their cautious glances. And then there was Jonathan Marks, the CEO. He sat directly across from her, his expression composed, but his eyes betrayed something deeper. Remorse, yes, but also uncertainty. He knew this wasn't going to be easy. He knew Helen wasn't here for a photo op. "I appreciate your time," Helen began, her voice calm but unmistakably firm. "But let me be clear from the start. This is not about an apology. I'm not here to be coddled or consoled. What happened on my flight was not a one-time oversight. It was the product of a system that has been allowed to operate unchecked." She paused, letting the words hang in the air, letting them sink. "I was not served a menu. I was dismissed when I asked for water. I was given the coldest service I've experienced in years of travel, all while every other passenger in first class was treated like royalty. Why? Because I didn't fit the picture of who you expect to see in that seat." Jonathan nodded solemnly, but she raised a hand. "Please don't interrupt me with sympathy. It's not what I came for." Around the room, she saw shifting. Some executives sat straighter. Others dropped their gaze. One woman placed her pen down and folded her hands. "I'm here because this," Helen said, tapping the folder she had brought, "is a pattern, not just for me. I've consulted for years on corporate ethics. I've read the surveys, the complaints, the letters. The same themes repeat. People of color being questioned about their boarding passes. Women in leadership being assumed to be assistants. Service that subtly, consistently tells us we don't belong. And the responses, a quiet phone call, a private apology, a "we'll do better next time." That's not accountability. That's damage control. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. Her power was in her restraint, in the dignity she carried even as she laid bare her pain. "I want real change," she continued. "And that starts here, with you, with policy, with structure, with training that doesn't just check a box, but changes behavior. With a complaint process that actually protects those who speak up. With leadership that models respect instead of performing it for optics." Jonathan finally leaned forward. "You're right. Everything you're saying is right, Helen. I'll admit our system is flawed. We need help. We need to rebuild." Helen nodded. "Then let's rebuild it together. I've outlined a plan in the folder in front of each of you. It includes mandatory inclusivity and bias training, not once but ongoing. It includes a third-party review of your HR complaint system. It includes anonymous reporting, protections for whistleblowers, and clear consequences for repeated offenders, no matter how long they've been with this company. It also includes a diversity advisory board, staffed not just by internal employees, but by external voices, including mine. There was a pause, then the rustle of papers as they opened the folder. As they read, Helen's eyes drifted to the window. The city moved outside. Taxis, buses, people, every one of them trying to make it through their day without being diminished. That's all she wanted. That's all most people wanted. But the system had made even that feel like a luxury. One executive finally spoke. "This is a lot. It's ambitious." Helen looked at him. "So is the damage you've allowed to happen under your watch." Another voice, a woman in legal, added, "There will be resistance from employees, from unions, from the board even." "Good, Helen said. "Change without resistance isn't change, it's decoration." The room fell quiet again. Jonathan glanced at the others, then back at Helen. "I'll sign off on this today, but I want you to stay involved. Help lead it." Helen's lips curved just slightly. "I'll help," she said, "but I won't babysit." And then she closed her folder, stood, and looked around the room one last time. "This isn't about me being angry. It's about me being done with polite excuses. You can't fix what you won't name, and today, you've named it. Now show me what you'll do with it." As she walked out of the boardroom, her heels clicking against the floor, Helen felt a strange emotion rise up. Relief, yes, but also a sense of grief. Grief for how long it had taken. For how often people like her had to fight just to be seen. But beneath that, there was something steadier. Resolve. This fight wasn't over. But maybe, just maybe, a door had finally opened. To those listening now, don't settle for nice words. Demand better. Hold systems accountable. And when someone like Helen shows the way forward, support her. Uplift her. Share her story. If you believe change starts with truth, hit the like button. If you've ever experienced quiet injustice, comment below and let us know you're not alone. And if you want more stories of dignity, power, and systemic change, subscribe. Because voices like Helen's, they deserve to echo. The boardroom was silent when Helen walked in. A wall of glass windows cast reflections of a gleaming city below, but inside the air was thick with tension. Executives shifted in their leather chairs, their conversations trailing off at the sight of her. Helen's steps echoed on the polished floor, each one measured, each one deliberate. She wore a slate gray suit, tailored to perfection, not just for style but for armor. Her calm expression betrayed none of the fire that smoldered just beneath her skin. She had not come here for a meeting. She had come for a reckoning. "Miss Carter," said Jonathan Marks, the CEO, rising from his seat with an awkward smile. "Thank you for joining us." She gave a slight nod, eyes scanning the room. Alhamdulillah, 10 men, 2 women, all white, all complicit. Most had read the report by now. Some looked away. One fiddled nervously with a pen. None of them knew what it felt like to be made invisible in a space you had every right to occupy. Helen sat across from them, placing her folder on the table like a gavel. "I assume the investigation has concluded," she said, her voice calm but firm. Jonathan cleared his throat. "Yes, it has. Chloe?" He gestured to the airline's chief human resources officer. Chloe flipped through a folder. "We conducted internal interviews with the flight crew from your flight, reviewed performance histories, and cross-referenced prior complaints. The findings are disturbing." Helen arched an eyebrow. "Disturbing is one word for it." Chloe looked down. "The lead flight attendant, Catherine Ellis, has been terminated effective immediately. She had 3 prior complaints, all quietly filed away, never investigated. Her conduct on your flight, it wasn't a first offense, it was a pattern." Helen's stomach turned. She knew it. Knew what had happened to her wasn't new, just rarely challenged. "And the others?" she asked. "Jeff Wallace," Chloe continued, "was also terminated. He enabled the behavior, ignored your concerns, and displayed willful negligence." Helen folded her arms. "Anyone else?" Chloe hesitated. 2 other crew members were placed under review. One resigned before we could complete the process. The other, Megan Hall, offered a written statement expressing remorse. She's agreed to help us build a new inclusivity training program. She'll remain on a probationary contract. Helen nodded slowly. She remembered Megan, her hesitation, her eyes darting with discomfort. At least one person had tried to do the right thing, even if it was late. And the systemic failures? She asked, turning her attention to Jonathan. Policies mean nothing if no one enforces them. What do you plan to do about that? Jonathan looked tired now, but not from work, from accountability. We're implementing your recommendations immediately. Mandatory training for all flight and gate staff, real-time passenger feedback channels, and executive-level oversight of bias-related complaints. We've also created an external review board, and we'd like you to chair it. A pause filled the room, a heavy one. Helen didn't answer right away. She stared at them. These were the same people who had smiled at her in photos, shaken her hand in meetings, praised her for her insight, and yet none of them had intervened when Catherine Ellis was quietly allowed to continue mistreating passengers like her. She leaned forward, her voice cool as frost. I'll chair the board, she said, but let me be clear. This isn't about PR. This is about integrity. And if you treat this like window dressing, I'll walk away, and I won't walk away quietly. The silence in the room grew sharper. Jonathan nodded. Understood. Helen stood and gathered her things. Good. Then we're done here, for now. As she stepped into the hallway, Maria, her assistant, was waiting with a warm cup of coffee. That looked intense, she said gently. Helen allowed herself a breath. It was, but it's not over. Maria walked beside her down the hallway. There's something you should know, she said, hesitating. While you were in the meeting, we received an email. It's from a passenger, someone on your flight. Helen stopped. Maria opened her tablet and read, Dear Miss Carter, I don't know if you remember me, but I was seated 2 rows behind you. I saw what happened. I didn't say anything at the time, and I've regretted it ever since. I want you to know your courage inspired me. You made me realize silence is complicity. I've reported what I witnessed and have pledged to speak up in the future. Thank you for your strength. Helen's eyes stung unexpectedly. She blinked hard. You made a difference, Ian, Maria said quietly, but it hadn't always felt that way. Not when she sat on that plane, a lump in her throat, wondering if she was overreacting. Not when Lisa pretended she didn't exist. Not when every smile around her skipped her row. Not even when she picked up the phone and made the call to Jonathan. It felt isolating, exhausting. She didn't do it for herself. She did it for the woman who might not have had the voice to push back. For the young black girl traveling alone in a seat someone would someday say she didn't belong in. For every quiet injustice that goes unspoken and unchecked. And now people were starting to listen. Later that evening, as Helen sat in her hotel room, she read over the airline's internal memo that Jonathan had promised to release. In it, he acknowledged systemic failures, promised sweeping reform, and mentioned the creation of an oversight committee. Her name was there, listed as the chair. She stared at it for a long moment before closing the file, and then her phone buzzed again. A message from Megan Hall. Miss Carter, I know I failed to speak up when it mattered most, but I want you to know your words stayed with me. I've applied to transfer departments so I can be part of building something better. I don't expect forgiveness, but I do want to thank you. Helen read it twice. She didn't respond right away. Instead, she stared out at the skyline. The city pulsed below her, unaware that something powerful had shifted. This was more than a policy change. It was a seed, planted in truth, watered with courage. And Helen would make sure it grew into something real. If you found this story moving, let us know in the comments. What part resonated most with you? And don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories of strength, justice, and transformation. Helen's fight didn't just change an airline. It reminded us that change begins when one person refuses to stay silent. Helen sat in silence, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across her hotel suite as her phone vibrated gently on the table. She stared at the screen, an email from Jonathan Marks, the CEO of the airline. The subject line read, Official Invitation, Advisory Board on Equity and Ethics. She didn't open it immediately. Her hands hovered above the phone, trembling slightly, not from nerves, but from the sheer weight of it all. Days had passed since the flight where everything unraveled. The humiliating refusal of basic service, the invisible wall erected between her and the rest of first class, and the cold glances that told her without words, you don't belong here. She had endured it not with anger, but with dignified silence. a strength that had become second nature after a lifetime of navigating spaces never built with her in mind. And now this, an invitation to join the fight not from the outside, but from the inside. But Helen had learned long ago that titles and seats at the table meant nothing if the table was still rotten underneath. When she finally tapped the screen, the message opened with flattery. Your insight, your courage, your leadership during the incident have been deeply impactful. She skimmed past the pleasantries. What mattered was at the bottom. We would be honored if you would join our new Equity and Ethics Advisory Board. You will have voting power and authority to help guide major systemic changes. Her breath caught slightly at those words. Real power, real influence, but also real responsibility. She leaned back into her chair, the cushion pressing gently against her shoulders. The soft hum of the city below filtered in through the glass windows. She thought of the passengers who had watched her on that flight, some silently supportive, others just uncomfortable. She thought of the flight attendants who had ignored her, belittled her, and tried to make her feel small. And she thought of Megan, the one attendant who had later whispered an apology, her voice shaking with regret. Helen hadn't acknowledged her at the time, but the sincerity had stayed with her. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Maria, her assistant, stepped inside holding a printed version of the proposal. They're serious, Maria said. It's a full initiative, budget, policies. They've already drafted new training programs. But they want you to legitimize it. You'd be the face of the reform. Helen's eyes narrowed. I don't want to be their redemption story. I'm not here to clean up their mess and pose for a photo. I told them that, Maria said softly, but I also told them you're not someone they can use. You're someone they need to listen to. Helen stood and walked to the window, her arms crossed over her chest. The skyline glowed in the afternoon light, so vast, so full of promise and contradiction. Do you know how many boards I've been asked to join? She said quietly. They want my face, my voice, but not my truth. The moment it gets uncomfortable, they shut down. Maria stepped closer. This doesn't have to be like the others. You could rewrite how these boards operate. If you accept, make them earn your presence. Set the rules. Helen turned, her jaw tightening. Then let's write the rules. She picked up the phone, hit reply, and typed, I will consider your invitation under one condition. I will not be a symbol. I will not be your absolution. If I join, it will be with full authority to call out what needs to be called out and demand that it's fixed, not delayed, not debated, acted upon. If that's acceptable to you, we can proceed. She pressed send and waited. 10 minutes later, her phone rang. Helen, came Jonathan's voice, cautious but earnest. I got your response. I agree, completely. Do you? Helen asked, her voice low. I do, and I know we have a lot of work to do. Then let's get started. 2 weeks later, Helen sat at the head of a long mahogany table inside the airline's corporate office. Around her were department heads, executives, policy writers, and silence. Not the kind born from respect, but the kind that stung with the realization that this woman, calm and composed, had more clarity than any of them. She had reviewed every complaint filed over the last 5 years, every half-hearted training module, every internal memo that danced around the truth. She didn't bring rage to the table. She brought facts, receipts, data, stories, and truth cuts deeper than anger. In one folder was the story of a young Black woman who had been denied assistance for her elderly mother during a flight. In another, a gay couple who had been refused seating together under the pretense of policy. The patterns were clear. Helen read them aloud one by one as executives looked down in shame. This isn't about discomfort, she said. It's about accountability. I didn't come here to be polite. I came here to make sure no one else has to walk off one of your planes feeling erased. The room was still. From that day forward, Helen wasn't just a member of the advisory board. She was its spine. Every proposal had to pass her scrutiny. Every initiative had to meet her standards. She helped launch a whistleblower portal for staff to report discrimination. She mandated an annual review of customer complaints, not by PR, but by ethics auditors. She even rewrote part of the company's mission statement to include the phrase, "Respect is not optional, it is owed." Months later, she was invited to speak at the company's town hall. Thousands of employees streamed the event live. She stood at the podium, the company's logo behind her, and spoke without notes. What happened to me on that flight was personal, but the reason I'm here now is not. I'm here for the quiet ones, the ones who are still scared to speak up, the ones who think that they have to endure indignity to survive. No more. We are building a system where silence is no longer the safest option and where dignity is no longer something passengers have to earn. The room erupted in applause. Some stood, others cried. And in that moment, Helen knew this fight had been worth it. Not because it was easy, but because it was necessary. On a quiet Sunday morning, the soft rustling of leaves danced with a gentle breeze as Helen strolled through the city park, her steps unhurried, her spirit calm. The last few weeks had been a whirlwind, meetings with airline executives, press interviews, and the quiet, powerful work of building something new from the ruins of what once failed her. The flight where she had been dismissed and disrespected was no longer just a painful memory. It had transformed into something larger, something powerful. Helen, with her poised presence and resolute heart, had not only demanded accountability, she had ignited a ripple effect. What began as an isolated act of discrimination had evolved into a movement that inspired thousands. As she walked past a fountain where sunlight danced across the rippling water, she heard a quiet voice behind her. "Excuse me, are you Helen Carter?" The voice was soft, unsure. Helen turned and found herself facing a young woman, maybe in her early 20s, with bright eyes and dark curls tucked beneath a denim cap. She was clutching a worn notebook to her chest and looking at Helen as if she were meeting someone she'd only read about. "Yes," Helen said with a warm smile. "That's me." The young woman took a nervous step closer. "I just wanted to say thank you. I saw your story. About the flight, about what you did afterward. I've dealt with similar things, not just while traveling, but at work, at school, even just walking down the street. I used to think staying quiet was the safest way, but then I saw how you handled it, with strength, with grace, and I realized maybe we don't always have to stay quiet. Maybe it's okay to speak up." Helen felt her throat tighten, her eyes glistening with emotion. She had faced many moments of doubt since that flight, nights where she'd wondered whether it was worth the fight, whether anyone was really listening. And now here stood living proof that her courage had done more than change policy. It had reached someone's heart. "What's your name?" she asked gently. "Kayla," the young woman replied, her voice steadier now. "Well, Kayla," Helen said, placing a hand lightly on her shoulder, "never doubt your voice again. It matters more than you know." Kayla smiled, the kind of smile that carried both healing and hope. And after a few more words, she walked away, her steps light, her head high. Helen watched her go, her heart full. That was it, the moment that made everything worth it. Back at home that evening, Helen sat at her desk, sunlight pouring in through the windows as she opened her laptop. The airline's advisory board had implemented every one of her recommendations. Complaints were now handled with urgency. Inclusivity training was real, effective, and mandatory. 3 more companies had reached out to her for help reshaping their corporate cultures. The changes were real, but the real victory? It was Kayla. It was every person who had reached out through emails, messages, and comments saying, "Your story gave me the strength to speak up." She began typing a new blog post titled, "The Flight That Changed Everything." In it, she recounted the pain of being dismissed, the power of staying composed, and the strength it took to demand justice. But she also wrote this: "We don't always choose the battles that find us, but we can choose how we respond, with integrity, with purpose, and with the belief that our voices can create change, not only for ourselves, but for those who come after us." As she clicked publish, comments began flowing in within minutes. "Helen, your story made me cry. Thank you for standing up for all of us. Subscribe to this channel because this is the kind of leadership we need. I've been there. I felt so alone, but now I know I'm not." Helen placed a hand on her chest, steadying her emotions. She had always said justice wasn't just about what we fix, it's about what we inspire. And now she saw that truth reflected in every message, every voice echoing her strength. To those listening now, maybe you've faced moments where you felt unseen, unheard, or disrespected. Maybe you've questioned whether speaking up was worth the risk. Let Helen's story remind you that quiet strength can be louder than rage, and dignity can be more disruptive than shouting. Real change doesn't come from noise. It comes from unwavering conviction, from refusing to shrink, from choosing to believe that even a single moment can ripple outward and shift the tide. So if you've been moved by Helen's journey, if her courage sparks something in you, please like this video, drop a comment below to send her your support, and most importantly, subscribe to this channel so we can continue sharing stories like this. Stories that remind us we're not alone. Stories that push back against injustice. Stories that show us how change really begins, with you, with me, with us. Thank you for being here. Let's keep the ripple going.